And this is Northern Grandstand. I'm Grant Bell, welcoming into the studio Dr. Joe Lukens. Doc, how are you?
I'm good, thank you, Grant. Beautiful day today.
It is a lovely day. And it's a day to feel positive about things.
Absolutely.
To share some affirmations around what you're doing and record some affirmations and perhaps even believe in yourself.
To believe in yourself. That's what we all need to do, isn't it? Our foundations for success.
Most definitely. It is interesting. We're talking about belief because you've just released a new book. It's part of your series that you've looked at, which, if I label them all almost a self-care kit that athletes could take with them. They're books also that they can share with their coaches when they're thinking about what they're doing. And further than that, it's something you could take into the workplace.
Yeah, one of the things we know about performance, I was just talking to producer Jess about this on the way in.
I'm glad you did, because per performances, sometimes it needs a bit of work.
I'll leave a copy with her on the way out. I'll leave her your copy. But what we know about performance is the lessons translate across any discipline that we're in, isn't it? Whether we're on the stage, whether we're at work, whether we're on the sporting field.
We're dealing with our family.
Absolutely. So life is a performance. So there's lessons, and we know that success leaves clues. So hopefully what I've been able to do through my writing is to share some of the clues about what success looks like, some of the strategies, and then just to help people set themselves up to get closer to their goals. And what they're wanting to achieve.
Yeah, I remember, and I read in your book, and it made me think back in your forward, or the little bit you talk about Graham Lowe and meeting Graham Lowe, and it almost being your first foray into what does this team environment and working with a team, and how perhaps you can't influence the whole team without influencing individuals who influence the team by the way of almost being your proxies into that broader spectrum. And it gave me cause to think about the early stages at the Newcastle Knights. When we first started off, we had a sports psychologist, a fellow called Dr. Roger Peters. I nearly said Roger Peters. And Roger came in, and he was a lecturer at Newcastle Uni, but he was also a psychologist with a strong passion for sport as opposed to being a sports psychologist. And he had an interesting approach, and it was very much to say, when you come into sport, you've got to be able to concentrate for a period, then go away. And he took it from the mechanics point of view, and he said to the players, I want you to start learning to read. And I'm not meaning in a derogatory way, but he said, you've got to concentrate on what you're doing for 40 minutes, then you get 10 minutes off. I'm not going to make you read for 40 minutes straight up, but we'll start reading in sections, and then we'll progress it up, because concentration and your ownership of what you're doing and your behaviours is really important. And it made me think about the good habits that you talk about in the book here and some of the strategies that are there. And certainly I think we don't necessarily need a psychologist who's going to put us on the couch. You need a psychologist who can help us to understand the best of ourselves.
Absolutely. And I think it is about understanding, particularly when it comes to our performance. So whatever our sport, we might be out there for 80 minutes, we might be a 100-metre runner, we might be out there I wouldn't be out there for 10 seconds, I'd be out there for probably almost a minute. But anyway, for whatever that time is, the reality is we spend more time in life through our week than we do on the court or on the field or in the pool and so forth. So it makes sense, doesn't it, that we would practice our skills for performance in those other settings. I know when one of the big messages, and I talk about it in the book, is about the difference between knowing when to react and when to respond in situations. Yeah. Both of those things serve us well when we do them in the right moment. But if we disagree with what an umpire or referee says, maybe that's the chance to respond rather than to react. Otherwise, you might find yourself sitting on your bum for a while. But the only way you're going to do that on the field is if you practice it, say, at home. So when I've had an athlete do that and they practiced reacting versus responding at home, they came back to me 2 weeks later and said, it's bizarre, we're not arguing as much anymore. And I went, fancy that. So we know that we're in our performance settings, if we practice them outside of it, then it equips us, particularly sports high pressure. So we're not going to think of it otherwise.
You said reacting versus responding. Take us a little further into that.
I think whenever there's any event, so an example of a reaction that serves us well is if we're driving in the traffic and someone cuts us off. So understandably, foot on the brake is what we need to do, and that serves us well. That's a reaction. It's instinctive. We don't really think about it. What we might do then is we might get a little bit irritated by the person who was in front of us and conjure a story for ourselves. So then the choice is then, do I react in this situation or do I respond? So the response might be that whenever we respond in a situation, we take a pause. So if, let's go back to the sporting example, the umpire that makes a call that you disagree with, if you've got it together enough to take a breath and have a think, and you are the captain, then you can respond to that umpire in a way that probably serves you better. And the biggest thing that I say to athletes is if you react when it would have been better for you to respond, you've actually surrendered your control. And most athletes I know don't like being out of control. So when we learn to respond in situations, particularly those high pressure moments where perhaps something's gone wrong, then we maintain control. And that's usually the best way I've found to sell it to athletes. But reacting versus responding, all the environments that I work in, whether it's I work in sporting environments, I work in defence, lots of different settings, but also I practice it at home, because if ever there's a grounds for us to practice things, it's usually in our home environments as well.
Yeah, and that responding gives us time to think. Again, throwing back to my time at the Knights, and one of the players went in to see Roger, and he said to Roger, look, I find that I'm pretty quiet and I'm an unassuming sort of person, and I'd like to have some aggression. And it was almost like, can you write a prescription for me such that I've got aggression?
Where's the switch?
And he gave an example of some players who played with this aggression. And he said, that's out of control. Aggression is a reacting, you're doing something that's out of control. How about if we give you assertion, where that's something that you're in control of and you're making decisions for your team and with your team, where you know what the outcome's likely to be from your behaviour.
Yeah, and that's such a great point, because we know that for humans, whether we like it or not, it's mood and emotion that drives our behaviour. And our moods and emotions come from the stories we tell ourselves. So
the earlier we can recognise
Absolutely.
a situation.
Absolutely. So you take the situation and then you have that pause where you might think, you might take a breath, you might even need to go and get yourself a drink of water if you've got the luxury of time, and then you can respond in the situation. Reactions are those split-second moments. And again, they have their place. On the footy field, there's a sudden little tiny break in the play and you just go for it. You don't even think.
You don't react.
You absolutely need to react. It has its place, but if you punch someone in the head, there's going to be a consequence to that. So those situations, responding serves us much better.
And I think as a coach, quite often, I would talk to players when I'm doing a video session, and I talk about times where we've reacted, and we've reacted either because we haven't read the situation well enough early enough to be in a prepared situation, or that the player around us isn't ready for a defensive decision, and they've let down. So I've now got to react because the connection isn't there between myself and the player alongside of me.
And depending upon whether that reaction serves the purpose, you surrender control and then it all goes awry usually.
Yeah. Joe, when you put these series of books together, did you have an ultimate idea of what you were looking for with it?
Yeah, I just want to thank you for asking that question. So I wanted to put some resources together. I guess what I think about when I write books is, what are the questions I'm commonly asked? What are the things that teams or individual athletes are seeking assistance on? So I just want it to be a bit of a guide for people to have a resource, because a lot of people obviously learn well through reading and thinking about it. So this book, Belief, is the precursor to the next book that I've started writing. I'm about a quarter of the way through it, which is called Compete. And the story, if I can just quickly share about why did I write the books in those orders, because I knew I wanted to write a book called Belief. I knew I wanted to write one called Compete, but I didn't know where to start or which one to do first. So I quizzed athletes and coaches over a course of a month and kept a little paper tally in the back of my notebook of which if you had one book in front of you, which would you pick up? And by the end of the month, it was a futile exercise, because I had 50-50. Half of them wanted Belief, half of them wanted Compete. And then a young athlete that I'd been working with for a period of time, I asked him and he just instantly went Belief. And I said, you've answered that very quickly. What makes you say Belief? And he said, Joe, you can't compete unless you have belief. So I thought that's a pretty good answer to that question.
And I think that's true. I look at Wayne Bennett, coach rugby league teams, and they've got a belief that no matter what the situation is, if we're close enough, we can win it at any time. And I recall him having conversations about that with Origin and saying, if we're close enough, we can believe that we will get home in the game.
Absolutely.
And we'll make that last bit. And I think about it in terms of a basketball match where the whistle goes and the time stops, it goes stop. And that whole construct of the last 5 minutes can be 20 minutes of game time. And the more you're in control, the more you can manufacture a result to your benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that when we look at the predictors of high performance, there's a whole range of things that we look at. We talk about all the basics. We talk about sleep and we talk about fuel. belief sits right in there with those concepts, I think, because it sets us up. And as I was saying before, the way we think influences how we feel. So our belief drives our mood and our mood drives our behaviour.
So how much is belief, does that sit around process? Because we hear the coaches, the new click term in coaching is about working to your processes. And the players talk about, if our processes are right, we will get the result we want. And there's this belief in the process or the systems. I don't know whether you saw last night's situation with Scotty Scheffler, the golfer.
I heard you talking to Jess about it this morning. I couldn't believe it when I heard it.
World number one golfer, and he's arrested on his way in to have some breakfast and start his warm-up. And he got released in less than an hour before his tee time, that he had to then get escorted back to the ground by the police who arrested him, get on and have a shortened but in a focused practice and go out and play a sensational round. And for mine, I thought, gee, this is a great entree into this book. And the things that I've looked in the book, he knew what his processes were, and he had a belief that I can park that and deal with that later, but my system is good enough that I can believe in that to get and do it.
Yeah, and it's about athletes having flexibility with their systems too. So presumably he went through most of his routine. We saw the same thing at the World Cup. I went with the PNG Orchids. In our very first game, everything in the setup for that game went awry. We were on the highway, it was running late, it was raining. The dressing sheds were too small for all the players to fit in there at once. The national anthem, the soundtrack broke down. The players didn't get the normal warm-up. The field was a surface none of them had ever played on before. But you just have to be able to adapt and, like you say, believe that. What can we control? What can we not control? And when you've got that set up for yourself, then you can pretty much deal with any of the adversities, because that's just another thing to overcome. And he's got an amazing story. You wouldn't believe that in a movie, would you?
No, you wouldn't. And you wouldn't. I don't know how many athletes have got that ability to have that level of focus and concentration, and he was cool.
I must say, I do a lot of preparation work with athletes for competitions about what could be the adversities and then how will you overcome them. And I've never suggested to an athlete that you get arrested on the way to the competition. So it's a new one to add to the repertoire, I think.
Tell me, with the book, is it a book for parents as well, that they can then understand and talk to their competitive young person in the house and perhaps help them get some belief?
I think it's a good tool for anyone. Educators, coaches and parents can all read it and take some information from it. I've actually had quite a few parents with some of my other books as well read the book along with their child. And so then it generates conversations and discussions and so forth. So if it's got people thinking about what do we know about belief, and there's some guidelines in there about what's not helpful. I always look at things through the lens of what's helpful, what's not helpful. I just hope it's a good companion for parents and for athletes and helps to build understanding about generating belief.